Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt guilty, exhausted, and lost, even though you loved her deeply? Carl Jung once said, "The shadow you do not face will control you from behind, and you will call it fate." It's a powerful statement, one that cuts deep when you think about it. How often have we found ourselves caught in the emotional turbulence of a relationship, unable to break free, even when we know it's not healthy? We may love the person, but the emotional manipulation, the guilt, the confusion, it lingers. It's almost as if we're tied to them by invisible strings, unable to escape. Today, we're going to uncover the reason behind this. Why is it that most men are emotionally enslaved in relationships, unable to break free, even when they know deep down it's harming them? It's not just about emotional attachment. There's something far deeper at play. This is the quantum trap of love. A trap where emotions become weapons used unconsciously by women to control and manipulate the emotional world of the man. This is not a critique of women. It's a deep exploration into human nature, into how emotions become tools in relationships, and how men can often become unwitting victims of this manipulation. Carl Jung's psychoanalysis offers a startling perspective on why this happens, how it operates on an unconscious level, and how men can wake up from this emotional slavery. So if you've ever wondered why, no matter what you do, you can't break free from her emotional grasp, this video is for you. We'll explore Jung's forbidden truth about the nature of love emotions and how men can reclaim their power. In order to understand why men often find themselves emotionally ensnared in relationships, we must first explore the core concepts of Carl Jung's psychology, particularly his theories of the anima and the shadow. These are not merely abstract concepts. They are deeply connected to the dynamics of love attachment and emotional control. Jung's idea of the anima is key to understanding why men often become emotionally trapped in relationships. The anima is the unconscious, idealized image of the feminine within a man's psyche. This image is built from all of the positive qualities that a man associates with femininity: beauty, nurturing grace, and yes, sometimes emotional instability. Jung believed that men are unconsciously drawn to women who embody this idealized image. The anima doesn't exist in the real world as a perfect woman, but rather as a projection of the man's inner emotional and psychological needs. Men fall in love with this projection, which often distorts reality, creating an emotional bond based on illusion rather than authenticity. The problem is that the anima is not real. It's a product of the man's psyche, a psychological construct that can never be fully realized in the woman. This makes the relationship inherently flawed. No matter how much love or affection the man gives, he is always chasing after something unattainable, the idealized version of femininity that exists only in his mind. This is where emotional manipulation begins, because the man's emotional attachment is to an image and not to the woman herself. He often fails to see her true nature. In fact, women can unwittingly manipulate this anima projection because men are unconsciously primed to give them emotional power, often without even realizing it. The second major concept Jung presented is the shadow, the unconscious aspect of the personality that contains repressed weaknesses, desires, and emotional wounds. The shadow is composed of the aspects of ourselves that we reject or deny, the parts we don't want to face because they challenge our conscious sense of self. In relationships, especially romantic ones, the shadow plays a powerful role. The emotional pain, fear, or unresolved issues that men carry from their past often surface in relationships. When a man hasn't dealt with his emotional wounds, be they related to past trauma, fear of rejection, or unresolved childhood experiences, he projects these unresolved issues onto his partner. This is where the emotional manipulation begins to take shape. Women, whether consciously or unconsciously, can tap into the unresolved emotional triggers of men's shadows. For instance, if a man's shadow involves fear of inadequacy or fear of abandonment, a woman's behavior may trigger these fears in subtle ways, such as withdrawing affection or using emotional silence as a form of control. The man, now emotionally vulnerable, finds himself reacting to the shadow's projection, and in doing so, loses his emotional autonomy. The emotional turbulence he feels is not merely the result of the woman's actions, it is the unconscious activation of his own unresolved fears and wounds. As these feelings are stirred up, he becomes more attached to her, trying to fix his emotional pain by seeking her validation or affection, even if it means giving up his own boundaries, self-respect, or personal autonomy. Jung believed that the emotional dynamics between men and women were not merely about superficial feelings of affection. Rather, they were deeply rooted in the unconscious, particularly the way emotions are projected, repressed, and manipulated at the subconscious level. Women, without even realizing it, can tap into a man's deep emotional triggers by aligning their behavior with the unconscious needs of his anima or shadow. For example, a woman may withdraw emotionally or create emotional distance only to reel him back in with affection or attention. This creates a dynamic where the man is constantly chasing the affection he so desperately craves. The relationship becomes a power struggle, not based on mutual love, but on emotional neediness. The woman, again, without realizing it, controls the emotional tone of the relationship, leaving the man emotionally unbalanced and dependent. Jung suggested that this kind of unconscious emotional manipulation occurs when the emotional energy between partners is unbalanced, when one partner, often the woman in this case, is more attuned to the emotional climate of the relationship and unconsciously wields emotional power to regulate it. The more the man seeks validation from her, the more he becomes dependent on her emotional responses, even as he believes he is in control. The emotional cycle that forms is like a feedback loop. The more the man invests emotionally, the more his partner's emotional reactions influence him. This is a trap. As the relationship continues, the man becomes entrapped by the need to receive affection and validation, often compromising his own desires, needs, and boundaries in the process. To break free from this emotional trap, awareness is key. Understanding that the emotional manipulation occurring in the relationship is rooted in unconscious dynamics can be the first step toward liberation. By recognizing that emotional reactions are being projected and that they are not necessarily a reflection of your partner's true intentions, you begin to disassociate from the power that these emotional patterns hold over you. Another crucial step is emotional detachment, not in the sense of closing off or becoming cold, but in the sense of creating space between your emotional reactions and your partner's emotional cues. This detachment allows you to regain control over your emotional state so that it no longer fluctuates based on her moods or behavior. Jung's theory of conscious integration is the antidote to this emotional enslavement. By becoming conscious of the shadow and understanding the emotional triggers you carry, you can prevent them from being manipulated by others. This involves working through past emotional pain and healing the wounds that give others the power to influence you. Only then can you engage in relationships that are grounded in mutual respect, where both partners are free from the unconscious patterns that lead to emotional control. Conclusion: the power of conscious love. Socrates once said, "Know thyself," and this is the first step toward breaking free from emotional manipulation. Jung's insights into the anima and the shadow reveal that love is not just a feeling, it's a psychic phenomenon that operates on unconscious emotional dynamics. When men and women enter relationships with unconscious emotional triggers, they become vulnerable to manipulation, which is often disguised as affection or care. The key to avoiding emotional enslavement is awareness, the ability to recognize these unconscious forces and detach from them. When you understand the deeper psychological patterns that influence your emotions, you can regain control and love freely without being manipulated. Breaking free from the quantum trap is about reclaiming your emotional power. By understanding yourself, setting healthy boundaries, and learning to navigate emotional dynamics with awareness, you can create a relationship that supports your autonomy and enhances your growth rather than diminishing your sense of self. The concept of emotional manipulation, especially in the context of relationships, often seems elusive, something that isn't overtly malicious but still deeply affects the dynamics between partners. Carl Jung's theory about the anima and the shadow offers a powerful lens to understand this emotional dynamic. Women, consciously or unconsciously, may use emotions as a way to gain control in a relationship, often without realizing the full extent of the influence they have. These emotional weapons are not just tools for manipulation, they are in many cases the result of unconscious projections and emotional needs. In this section, we'll explore some of the most common emotional weapons women use in relationships and how men can recognize and protect themselves from these subtle, often hidden tactics. One of the most potent emotional weapons is the silent treatment. Freud called it a form of passive aggression, where a person withdraws emotionally and refuses to communicate. On the surface, this may seem like a harmless conflict avoidance mechanism, but it's often a tactic used to punish or manipulate. For the man caught in this emotional trap, the silent treatment can feel like a powerless void. He may feel abandoned or guilty, unsure of what went wrong or how to fix it. The woman may withdraw, refusing to speak, yet she may expect the man to read between the lines to understand that his failure to meet her emotional needs has caused the distance. The more he tries to fill the void by apologizing, explaining himself, or offering gifts, the more he reinforces the emotional manipulation. The silent treatment creates a feedback loop where the man's emotional discomfort and eagerness to reconnect perpetuate the power dynamic. This isn't just about being quiet. It's about using silence as a form of control, where the woman's emotional withdrawal forces the man into a state of emotional uncertainty, always trying to fix what is unsaid. Recognizing this weapon requires awareness of the emotional impact silence has on you. When you feel compelled to chase affection, or when you feel guilty for situations that aren't fully explained, this may be a sign that the silent treatment is being used to manipulate your emotional state. Another emotionally manipulative tactic that many women unconsciously use is the guilt trip. This can take many forms, but it always involves leveraging guilt to manipulate a man's actions. Women may use statements like, "If you really loved me, you would do this for me. You never think of me when you do X. I feel so alone, but I guess you don't care about me." These phrases seem like innocent expressions of emotion, but in reality, they're designed to create emotional obligation. The man hearing these words feels a sense of guilt or responsibility to fix things. It may be a simple request, but the emotional undercurrent is powerful. He's not just being asked for something, he's being emotionally obligated. The problem with guilt tripping is that it doesn't allow for a healthy, balanced relationship. It creates a moral burden. The man feels like his worth is contingent on his ability to meet his partner's emotional needs. In this way, the woman is using guilt as a tool of control. When the man responds, he's not responding from a place of genuine desire or love. He's responding because he feels emotionally coerced. Freud's theory of projection plays into this as well. The woman may project her own unmet emotional needs or insecurities onto the man, making him feel responsible for them. The longer the man tolerates this behavior without addressing it, the more he becomes a puppet to her emotional needs, and the more she strengthens her hold over him. Another emotional weapon women use is the victim role. This is when a woman presents herself as constantly being in a position of emotional vulnerability, whether from past trauma, external pressures, or difficult life circumstances. She may turn to the man for emotional support, but the problem lies in the unspoken expectation that he must always be there to rescue her. While everyone has emotional struggles, when a woman consistently adopts the role of the victim, It places an emotional burden on the man. He feels compelled to protect, support, and fix things. This tactic feeds into a dependency dynamic where the man is seen as the provider of emotional stability. Over time, this undermines his autonomy. He feels as though his emotional purpose in the relationship is solely to care for her, to solve her problems, and to keep her happy. This is where emotional manipulation can be most subtle. The woman may genuinely need support, but by continuously playing the victim, she makes it difficult for the man to assert his own emotional needs. He might feel trapped in a cycle where his own emotions and desires are ignored in favor of focusing solely on hers. Another common tactic is the creation of drama, either through exaggerated emotional responses, conflict, or even subtle provocation. This creates a cycle of emotional ups and downs, leaving the man constantly trying to prove his love, devotion, and commitment. Drama is not just about creating arguments. It can also be about small emotional provocations designed to test the man's emotional investment. She might engage in passive-aggressive behavior such as subtle criticisms, undermining comments, or teasing that creates an emotional response in him. When he reacts, she might then reinforce the dynamic, suggesting that if he truly loved her, he would handle the situation better or act differently. This manipulation works because it creates an emotional roller coaster that the man gets stuck on, continuously chasing the moments of affection or approval. It's often framed as tests of love, but the truth is, they are emotional games that create dependency. The woman may feel emotionally powerful, knowing that the man is constantly proving his worth. 5. Gaslighting, making the man doubt his own reality. One of the most insidious emotional weapons is gaslighting. This involves subtly making the man question his own perception of reality, often leading him to doubt his own judgment, memories, or emotions. A woman might, for example, tell him he's overreacting, too sensitive, or misremembering a situation. The core of gaslighting is rejection of the man's emotional experience. This tactic makes him feel confused, anxious, and insecure because he begins to second-guess his own reality. He might begin to feel that his emotional reactions are unwarranted or even irrational. Over time, this erodes his self-confidence and his ability to trust his own instincts. Gaslighting is not only a way to undermine a man's emotional stability, it also creates dependency. When a man starts doubting his own judgment, he becomes more likely to seek constant reassurance from his partner, reinforcing the emotional control dynamic. He is emotionally enslaved not just by her actions, but by the confusion she sows in his mind. Understanding why men often fall into the emotional trap of manipulation and control requires a deep dive into the psychological conditioning and emotional dynamics that influence their behavior. Men are not born emotionally dependent or vulnerable to manipulation. Rather, they are shaped by a combination of societal conditioning, innate instincts, and unconscious desires that make them particularly susceptible to being emotionally enslaved in relationships. One of the primary psychological drivers behind a man's vulnerability to emotional manipulation is his innate desire to protect and serve the women he loves. This instinct has been evolved over centuries. Men are biologically wired to be the protectors, providers, and caretakers in relationships. While this is a noble impulse, it can become problematic when it leads men to sacrifice their own needs, desires, and boundaries in an attempt to fulfill the emotional needs of their partner. This protective instinct can often be manipulated by women, whether intentionally or unintentionally. If a woman plays the role of the vulnerable emotional figure in the relationship, the man will often feel the need to step into the role of the caretaker or fixer. In doing so, he subordinates his own emotional needs in favor of hers, inadvertently losing himself in the process. This dynamic is where emotional manipulation takes root. When the man continually focuses on meeting his partner's emotional needs, he starts to feel that his self-worth is tied to her emotional state. This can lead to a cycle where the man becomes emotionally exhausted, constantly trying to solve problems and soothe his partner while neglecting his own emotional well-being. Another reason why men fall into the emotional trap is the societal conditioning that reinforces specific ideas about masculinity. From a young age, men are taught to suppress their emotions to avoid appearing weak or vulnerable. The traditional ideals of masculinity demand that men be stoic, strong, and emotionally resilient, especially in relationships. This emotional repression creates a disconnection from their own emotions, which leaves them unprepared to process or understand the complex emotional dynamics at play in intimate relationships. When men are unable to fully connect with their own emotions, they become overly reliant on external validation, namely from the woman they are in a relationship with. The emotional validation from a partner can feel like a lifeline, and when it's withdrawn or manipulated, it can leave the man emotionally disoriented and seeking reassurance or affection to regain his stability. This is when men become trapped in emotional cycles that are controlled by their partner's behavior. In essence, the expectation that men shouldn't feel emotions leads them to become detached from their emotional needs, which makes them more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Without a clear understanding of their own emotional state, they can easily become entangled in their partner's emotional world. The fear of abandonment is another powerful emotional force that can keep men trapped in unhealthy relationships. Men often internalize a fear of being rejected or abandoned by the woman they love, especially when emotional or physical intimacy is involved. This fear can be deeply rooted in childhood experiences or past trauma, but it manifests strongly in relationships, often driving men to sacrifice their own needs in order to maintain connection and avoid the pain of rejection. This fear can make men blind to emotional manipulation. In relationships where their emotional needs are ignored or manipulated, the man's underlying fear of abandonment causes him to accept unhealthy behavior. He might tell himself that if he gives more sacrifices more, his partner will eventually love him more and the relationship will work out. But in reality, this cycle only perpetuates the manipulation, as the more the man gives, the more emotionally dependent he becomes and the less power he has in the relationship. Emotional manipulation becomes a tool for controlling this fear. If a woman knows how to use the withdrawal of affection or playing the victim as a means of inducing guilt, the man will start to feel like he's failing in his role as a partner. The emotional disconnect only reinforces his fear, and in turn, he works harder to fix things further, perpetuating the cycle of emotional slavery. One of the core reasons men fall into emotional dependency in relationships is their deep need for approval and validation, especially from their romantic partner. Many men derive a significant portion of their self-worth from the affection and appreciation they receive in their relationships. When that validation is withheld or used strategically, it creates a power imbalance. Men, particularly those who have not learned to cultivate self-love or emotional resilience, can become addicted to external validation. This is particularly dangerous when the emotional needs of their partner are met first and their own needs are consistently neglected. In these relationships, the man's emotional state is entirely dependent on whether his partner is satisfied or upset. The more he strives to please her, be it through acts of service, financial support, or emotional caretaking, the more emotionally enslaved he becomes. This need for external validation often leads men to lose their sense of self as they become more focused on meeting the emotional needs of their partner than on cultivating their own emotional health. Manipulation through approval becomes the subtle weapon that keeps the man emotionally attached and dependent. Finally, one of the biggest reasons men fall into the emotional trap is the lack of emotional education. Most men aren't taught how to process or understand their own feelings, let alone manage the emotional complexities of a relationship. Men are often expected to figure it out without being provided the tools or guidance necessary to navigate their emotions. Without these tools, men often react impulsively to emotional stimuli instead of responding thoughtfully. This lack of emotional intelligence leads to misunderstanding and emotional mismanagement, where men fail to recognize the signs of emotional manipulation, leaving them vulnerable to being controlled by their partner's moods and actions. Emotional manipulation thrives when there is a lack of awareness. Men who don't recognize the patterns of manipulation don't know how to protect themselves or break free from the emotional traps. By cultivating emotional intelligence, by learning to process their feelings, identify emotional triggers, and develop resilience, men can start to disengage from these toxic emotional cycles and regain their emotional independence. Escaping the emotional trap that keeps you tied to an unhealthy relationship requires more than just intellectual understanding. It demands a deep shift in emotional awareness, self-discipline, and mental clarity. It's about recognizing the emotional patterns that have been keeping you trapped and taking deliberate action to reclaim your autonomy and emotional independence. This process involves confronting your inner demons, setting healthy boundaries, and practicing emotional detachment. It's not an easy journey, but it's necessary for breaking free from the emotional cycles that dominate your life and relationships. Below are the essential steps to help you reclaim your emotional power and stop being a slave to the emotional manipulation around you. The first and most important step in breaking free from emotional entanglements is shadow work, a concept rooted in Carl Jung's theories of the unconscious. Jung believed that the shadow is made up of the parts of ourselves we repress or deny. These can be negative emotions, unresolved traumas, or unmet needs that we push aside because they are uncomfortable or difficult to face. However, these repressed parts of the self don't disappear. They become the driving forces behind our actions, reactions, and relationships. In the context of emotional manipulation, your shadow often holds unresolved emotional triggers that make you vulnerable to being manipulated. If you fear abandonment, feel inadequate, or lack self-worth, these feelings will be triggered in relationships. A manipulative partner can unconsciously exploit these vulnerabilities, often using them as emotional leverage. To begin shadow work, start by becoming aware of your emotional triggers. Reflect on moments when you felt out of control, anxious, or dependent in relationships. Ask yourself what fear or insecurity is at the root of these feelings. What parts of my past have I ignored or repressed that could be affecting my emotional responses? Shadow work involves writing down your thoughts, fears, and emotional triggers, then confronting them directly. This is a process of emotional integration where you acknowledge these aspects of yourself and accept them without judgment. Over time, by becoming aware of and embracing your shadow, you reduce its unconscious influence over your behavior, making it harder for others to manipulate you emotionally. The second step in breaking the emotional trap is emotional detachment. Emotional detachment doesn't mean shutting down or becoming cold. It means creating space between yourself and your partner's emotional state. When you allow your partner's emotions to dictate your emotional state, you become vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Whether it's her mood swings, her anger, or her passive-aggressive behavior, if you constantly react to her emotions, you'll never be able to regain control of your own. To practice emotional detachment, start by observing your emotional responses without judgment. The next time you feel overwhelmed or pulled into an emotional storm by your partner, try the following. Pause and breathe. Take a few deep breaths and ground yourself in the present moment. Identify the feeling. What emotion is being triggered? Is it fear, anger, guilt, or anxiety? Separate the emotion. Recognize that the emotion is your response, not an inherent part of the situation. This is your feeling, not necessarily your partner's reality. Respond mindfully. Rather than reacting impulsively, respond from a place of rationality and awareness. This is especially important in moments when your partner's emotions are manipulating yours. When you practice emotional detachment, you regain clarity and control over your emotions. You stop reacting out of fear of abandonment, guilt, or the need for approval, and instead you begin to respond based on what is best for you and the relationship. Boundaries are essential to creating emotional independence. Without boundaries, you leave yourself vulnerable to manipulation, as your partner may begin to intrude on your emotional space without even realizing it. Healthy boundaries are not about controlling the other person. They are about taking responsibility for your own emotions and ensuring that your needs are respected. Boundaries are lines that protect your emotional well-being, allowing you to maintain your autonomy within the relationship. To set boundaries, follow these steps. Identify your needs. What do you need in a relationship to feel emotionally secure? Do you need space to pursue personal hobbies, time alone, or the ability to express your emotions freely? Communicate your boundaries clearly. Have open, honest conversations with your partner about what you need. Explain the boundaries you are setting and why they are important for your emotional health. Learn to say no. Saying no is a critical part of boundary setting. You must be willing to prioritize your own needs, even if it means disappointing your partner. Saying no is not a rejection of her, it's an affirmation of self-respect. Enforce boundaries with consistency. Boundaries must be enforced with consistency. If your partner crosses a boundary, calmly remind them of it and take appropriate action to protect your space. Setting and maintaining boundaries helps you preserve your emotional power and prevents you from being drawn into cycles of emotional manipulation. One of the most common ways men become emotionally enslaved is through the misconception that love means possession. In traditional cultural narratives, love is often portrayed as a means of emotional validation, where you are complete when you are with the other person. This creates a dynamic where love becomes a dependency rather than a mutual exchange of growth and respect. But true love is not about possession, it is about freedom. It's about being in partnership, where both individuals bring their full selves into the relationship and support each other's growth. To break free from emotional enslavement, redefine what love means to you. Love should be liberating, not limiting. Love should amplify your life, not consume it. Love should enhance your emotional health, not drain it. Start by valuing yourself outside of the relationship. Engage in self-care activities that nourish your mind, body, and soul. Spend time developing your passions, your career, your friendships. The more whole and self-sufficient you are, the less likely you are to fall into emotional dependence. Love that is rooted in equality, respect, and mutual growth will help you avoid the emotional traps that keep you entangled in unhealthy relationships. When you enter relationships from a place of emotional strength and clarity, love becomes a beautiful connection, not a binding force.